Hello and welcome to today's graphic design tip of the day. For today's tip, we're going to look at font and typography in detail, starting with the anatomy of typography. So looking at this great little graphic here, you can see that I have each of the pieces described that we're going to talk about. Starting with kerning up here at the top, it's the spacing in between individual letters in your design. All of your letters are going to sit on your baseline, so you can see this line going across the bottom, except for if they have a descender. So the Y continues past that baseline. You can also see descenders down here for the P and the G going past that baseline. If a letter goes up above this other line here, which you can see is the X height of your text, that is going to be called an ascender. So it ascends up into the sky. The top of the T, the top of the H would be considered ascenders. The inside part of your letter, like the inside gap here in between the letter P, is called a counter. We also want to know that the line that goes up and down this vertical line as parts of our text is called a stem. So the top of the T to the bottom, the P line here would also be a stem as well. And that's about it as far as what we're going to cover today, as well as the serif versus sans serif, which again, I'll talk about in a little bit, but there's a couple more little parts here that you can see that are on the diagram as well. So let's talk about kerning. Specifically again, remember kerning is going to be the spacing in between individual letters. You can adjust the kerning in both Photoshop, Illustrator, as well as Graphic Designer, depending on which program you're using. And it's going to look like this symbol here with the V/A. And what you do is click right in between your two letters, and you can adjust that to either push the letters closer together or move them further apart. What you want is an even amount of space in between each of your letters, as if sand was filling in between those two letters. You want to make sure that it's filling the same kind of mass of sand. So by moving this over, you can see that the L is very close to the A here. It would be a very tight gap. You want to make sure that that's nice and close there. It looks way better as a font than having it so spaced out. So manually going in and adjusting the kerning on individual letters is super important. The tracking, if the font is really spread out, or if you're using a font like this that you want it to look more like a script font where it's touching each other, it looks handwritten, adjusting the tracking is the kerning of all of the letters in the same word or the same phrase. So you can see that the tracking has been adjusted here, pushing all of the letters closer together. So that is on Illustrator, Gravit, Photoshop as the letters VA with a little horizontal line. And again, I can either push them closer together, move them farther apart. I can also grab just specific sections. So maybe I just wanted the ING to be closer together. I can grab just that and adjust the tracking of just those set of letters without adjusting the rest of the word. Leading is going to be the space in between lines of text. So if you're writing some body text or a sentence, couple sentences, and they go down multiple lines, you can adjust the space in between them for readability or just for the style of the design that you're working in. So you can look here, my paragraph as an example is very close together. It becomes a little bit tough to read. You also have the problem with the ascenders and descenders that sometimes they end up touching each other depending on what type of font you're using, which makes it even harder to read. So by adding that little extra space or leading in between the lines, makes it way easier to read as a viewer. That can be adjusted again, Graphic Designer, Illustrator, Photoshop, using the option here where you can see it has two lines, two letters stacked on top of each other with that vertical arrow. Just select the lines of text, have them highlighted, and you can adjust that there. You can see all three of these things demonstrated, the kerning, the space in between the letters, where to get to it on your toolbar, this one specifically in Illustrator, and then your leading, your space in between your lines, again, where to adjust that here, and then finally you're tracking the spaces in between all of your letters and where you can find that, which is right here. There's 3 rules that I want you to consider when you're combining fonts together. Now, if you look online, you're going to see tons of websites that go through different things, and a lot of times they're going to say things as 2 separate bullet points that I'm going to push together into one because they relate. First example is a great example of what I was just saying. A lot of them will break up the font weight and point size in 2 different categories. Really, I think they go hand in hand. So you want to have contrasting font weights, so the actual thickness of your letters, but you also want to have contrasting point sizes. So remember, the point size is the size from your highest ascender to your lowest descender, or if it's a capital letter, just from the top to the bottom of your letters here, that's the point size. Bigger point size is going to make it stand out more. If it's a title, having a nice bold font that is a bigger point size is always a great thing to contrast something that is a thinner font that's going to be your subtext or body text. So here's a great example of both of those things utilized. Rule number 2 is keeping the mood, the style, the vibe of your font the same. Although you want them different enough where you can see the difference, you want to make sure that they have that same kind of feel to them. Again, there's tons of lists that you can find online that tell you kind of the moods and feelings behind fonts, but specifically I pulled 2 examples. One is for wedding invitations, so this kind of formal style font. You can see these kind of script fonts paired with either a sans serif font here or a script font paired with a serif font. It looks a little bit more formal that way. But this one's more of a whimsical look with the fun font at the top and a more modern style with this kind of handwritten font, but that really sleek, clean sans serif font underneath it. And again, same things, just some fonts for spring. 2 combinations that work really well. Again, going with the contrast we just mentioned before, both of our major fonts up here have more of a bold contrast. They're bigger point sizes, but the vibe of each of these go really well together. Just with that basic sans serif font flows really well with these kind of stylized fonts or even with a bolder sans serif font. Okay, and as I started to mention before, you want to make sure that your fonts are different enough. If they're too similar, they're not going to look good, even if it's a little bit bolder. This is a great example here where the font looks like it almost could be the same font, just a different point size. You really want to avoid that. Make sure it's significantly bolder if you're going to use a font that's within that same font family to create your visual hierarchy in your design. And I found a couple more graphics here that I think do a really nice job of things to think about as far as different ways that you can combine fonts together. These are a little bit more fun. These are more formal, maybe something you'd use for a website or blog, something professional. And then a couple do's and don'ts. I want to scroll down here to the don'ts because this is really important. Again, one that we were mentioning in this step. Don't combine fonts that are too similar. This is another example of fonts that were like the ones in my example up there, that they just look very, very similar. You don't want to mix your font mood. So just like I said, keep the moods similar. We don't want to mix them. Here's a great example of them mixed where just it looks ugly. It's too complicated as far as the different styles trying to be merged together in the same design. Avoid fonts that you can't read. There's no point to a font that you can't read unless you're just using it in an artistic way. If you're using something for a title, it can be more of those stylized fonts, but you do want to avoid fonts that you just can't read. Make sure that it's legible. Think of the purpose of your design. That's most important. And then there are a bunch of fonts that you don't ever want to use. If you go on Google, you can find lists of those standard fonts like Comic Sans, Curls. Those are just not good fonts. You've seen them. They just don't work. So avoid those. Look up those lists before you start using fonts in your design. We started to talk about serifs versus sans serifs, and here is a great example. You can see this is a serif font here on the left. It does have those feet and tails that I mentioned earlier. Sans serif fonts don't have feet and tails. Notice that they don't have those little extra extensions on them. So on this second example here, the circles are circling those little serifs, those little pieces that are off the letter that you saw on the left-hand side. I hope you enjoyed today's graphic design tip of the day.